Welcome back to our investigation into plant consciousness. I'm Justo, and if you watched the first episode, you know we're diving deep into one of the most controversial questions in science. Can plants actually think and feel? Last time, I introduced you to Cleve Baxter and his shocking claim that plants could read human thoughts. Today, we're going inside his laboratory to examine exactly what he discovered and why his findings sent shockwaves through both the scientific community and popular culture. But before we dive into Baxter's experiments, I need to tell you about something that happened to me just yesterday that made this investigation feel incredibly personal. I was preparing for this episode, surrounded by research papers and scientific journals, when I noticed something strange. The small pothos plant on my desk, which I'd barely paid attention to before starting the series, seemed to be turning its leaves toward me whenever I was reading about plant consciousness research. Now I know what you're thinking. Plants turn toward light sources. That's basic phototropism. But here's the thing. The light was coming from the window behind the plant, not from where I was sitting. Yet every time I looked up from reading about plant awareness, those leaves seemed to be oriented in my direction. Coincidence? Probably. But it got me thinking about how our expectations and beliefs might influence what we see and experience. This is exactly the kind of observation that started Cleve Baxter on his journey, and it highlights one of the biggest challenges in studying plant consciousness, separating genuine phenomena from wishful thinking, confirmation bias, and experimental artifacts. So let's go back to February 2nd, 1966, and put ourselves in Baxter's shoes. Picture a small office in New York City, filled with polygraph equipment and the tools of lie detection. Baxter had been working as a polygraph expert for the CIA and had interrogated suspects around the world. He understood better than almost anyone how to detect the subtle electrical changes that reveal human deception and emotion. On that morning, Baxter had watered his Dracaena plant and, as I mentioned in the last episode, decided to attach polygraph electrodes to one of its leaves. He was initially just curious about measuring the plant's electrical activity as water moved through its system. But what he saw on the polygraph paper changed everything. The pen began tracing patterns that looked remarkably similar to human emotional responses. In polygraph work, certain patterns indicate stress, fear, or deception. What Baxter was seeing from the plant looked exactly like what he would expect from a human who was emotionally aroused or under stress. But the real shock came when Baxter decided to test whether the plant might be responding to threats. He thought about burning one of the plant's leaves with a match. The moment that intention formed in his mind, before he had even moved toward the matches, the polygraph pen jumped dramatically. The electrical response was immediate and intense, as if the plant had somehow perceived his hostile intention. Baxter repeated this experiment over and over, and the results seemed consistent. The plant appeared to respond not just to actual threats, but to his thoughts about threats. Even more remarkably, when he only pretended to consider harming the plant, without any real intention to do so, the plant showed no response. It was as if the plant could distinguish between genuine and fake intentions. Word of Baxter's discovery spread quickly, and soon he was conducting more elaborate experiments. In one famous test, he set up an apparatus in another room that would randomly drop live brine shrimp into boiling water. The idea was to see if plants could perceive the death of other living organisms from a distance. According to Baxter, his plants showed dramatic electrical responses at the exact moments when the shrimp were dying, even though there was no way for the plants to know what was happening in the other room through conventional senses. Baxter called this phenomenon primary perception and claimed it was evidence of a fundamental interconnectedness between all living things. He theorized that plants, and potentially all living cells, were connected through some kind of biological communication system that operated beyond the known senses. The implications of Baxter's claims were staggering. If plants could perceive human thoughts and emotions, if they could sense the death of other organisms from a distance, it would fundamentally change our understanding of consciousness, communication, and the nature of life itself. But here's where the story takes a dramatic turn. When other scientists tried to replicate Baxter's experiments, most of them failed to get similar results. And when they looked closely at his methodology, they found serious problems. Dr. Arthur Galston, a plant physiologist at Yale University, was one of the first scientists to attempt replication. He followed Baxter's procedures as closely as possible but could not produce any evidence of plant responsiveness to human thoughts or distant events. Other researchers reported similar failures. Even more damaging were the methodological criticisms. Scientists pointed out that Baxter's experiments lacked proper controls. There was no way to rule out subtle environmental changes that might affect the plant's electrical activity. Temperature fluctuations, humidity changes, vibrations, electromagnetic interference from nearby equipment, or even the experimenter's own movements could potentially influence the sensitive electrical measurements. Perhaps most critically, Baxter himself was not blind to the experimental conditions. He knew when he was thinking threatening thoughts, when the shrimp were being killed, and when the various stimuli were being applied. This opened the door for unconscious bias in his interpretation of the polygraph traces. The scientific community's response was swift and harsh. Baxter's work was largely dismissed as pseudoscience, and he was accused of seeing patterns in random electrical noise. The failure of independent replication was seen as definitive proof that his claims were unfounded. But here's what fascinates me about this story. Despite the scientific rejection, Baxter's ideas captured the public imagination and never let go. Books were written, documentaries were made, and millions of people became convinced that plants were conscious beings capable of perceiving human thoughts and emotions. This raises profound questions about how we evaluate scientific claims and how popular beliefs about nature develop and persist. Why were people so ready to believe that plants could read minds? What does this tell us about our relationship with the natural world and our desire to find consciousness and connection everywhere we look? During my research, I had the opportunity to examine some of Baxter's original polygraph traces, and I have to admit, they are compelling. The patterns really do look like emotional responses, and the timing of some of the changes seems to correlate with the experimental stimuli. But looking compelling and being scientifically valid are two very different things. I also discovered that the story of Baxter's plant experiments has been distorted and exaggerated over the years. Many popular accounts include details that aren't supported by his original research or add dramatic elements that make the story more compelling but less accurate. For example, there's a widely circulated story that Baxter's plants could recognize people who had harmed other plants, reacting with fear when plant murderers entered the room. But when I traced this story back to its source, I found that it was based on a single, poorly controlled experiment that was never successfully replicated. This pattern of embellishment and distortion is common in popular science stories, especially those dealing with controversial or extraordinary claims. Each retelling tends to add new details, eliminate uncertainties, and make the findings seem more definitive than they actually were. But here's what I find most interesting. While Baxter's specific claims about plant telepathy have been largely debunked, his work did spark legitimate scientific interest in plant electrical activity and plant behavior. Researchers began to take a closer look at how plants actually do perceive and respond to their environment, and what they found was remarkable. It turns out that plants have incredibly sophisticated electrical signaling systems. They can detect light, gravity, touch, chemicals, and even sound waves. They can communicate with each other through chemical signals, warn their neighbors about insect attacks, and coordinate complex responses to environmental challenges. Recent research has shown that plants can learn from experience, remember past events, and even appear to make decisions. Dr. Monica Gagliano's experiments with Mimosa pudica demonstrated that plants could learn to ignore repeated harmless stimuli, showing a form of habituation that persists for weeks. Other studies have shown that plants can anticipate regular environmental changes and prepare for them in advance. So, while Baxter's claims about telepathic plants have been rejected, His broader intuition that plants are more sophisticated and responsive than we previously thought has been vindicated. The question is, where exactly is the line between legitimate plant capabilities and pseudoscientific fantasy? This is the question that's been haunting me throughout this investigation. Every time I think I've figured out what plants can and can't do, I discover new research that pushes the boundaries further. Every time I'm ready to dismiss extraordinary claims, I find legitimate scientific studies that seem almost as extraordinary. In our next episode, we're going to explore this cutting-edge research in detail. We'll look at what plants can actually do, how they do it, and what the implications might be for our understanding of intelligence and consciousness. We'll also examine the philosophical questions that arise when we consider the possibility that consciousness might not require a brain. But I want to leave you with a thought experiment. Imagine you're a plant rooted in one spot for your entire life. You can't move to escape danger or seek better conditions. How would you survive? How would you gather information about your environment? How would you communicate with other plants? How would you make decisions about when to grow, when to reproduce, when to defend yourself? The more I've learned about plant biology, the more I've realized that plants face incredibly complex challenges that require sophisticated solutions. They might not have brains, but they've evolved remarkable ways to process information, make decisions, and respond to their world. Whether this constitutes consciousness in any meaningful sense is still an open question. But one thing is certain, plants are far more remarkable than most of us ever imagined. And in our final 2 episodes, we're going to explore just how remarkable they really are.